The memory of that night is still incredibly vivid in my mind. I was only 6 years old. My life back then was simple, almost idyllic. Growing up on a farm in the countryside, the house we lived in was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded only by fields and trees, where the nights were always calm, the only sound being the leaves rustling in the wind. It was comforting for the most part. But that night, something felt different. My parents always had a routine for me. My mom would help me take a bath, put on my pajamas, and then my dad would come in to give me a goodnight kiss. He always repeated the same thing. "Don't forget to say your prayers before bed, son." It was an automatic phrase that I had come to expect. That night, he said the same, kissed my forehead, and turned off the light, closing the door softly to avoid making noise. I lay there for a while, still feeling the tranquility that always surrounded me. The crickets chirped outside, and occasionally the wind would blow harder, causing the dry leaves to fall and rustle on the ground. I remember lying there on my back, staring at the ceiling in the dark. I don't know how long I stayed like that, motionless, waiting for sleep to come. Perhaps it was the excessive quiet, but soon the strange feeling that something was wrong began to grow inside me. It was as if, suddenly, the silence was no longer a comforting companion, but a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to tighten around my throat. I tried to ignore it, forcing myself to close my eyes, counting the seconds in my head to try to calm the anxiety that rose without any apparent reason. And then, I heard it. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, but completely out of place. A dry, scratching noise, like something scraping against wood. I felt my body stiffen instantly. The sound seemed to come from beneath me, directly from the floor under my bed. I tried to rationalize, thinking it might be a rat or some other animal from the farm that had gotten in. But something about that sound terrified me. It wasn't a simple scratching. It was slow and continuous, as if something or someone was intentionally scraping the wood, deliberately trying to scare me. My heart began to pound in my chest, my fingers gripping the sheets tightly. I felt sweat start to trickle down my forehead, even though the night was cold, and the sound continued, louder now as if it were close, right beneath me. My instincts told me to jump out of bed and run to my parents' room, but I was paralyzed. Fear took hold of every fiber of my being, preventing me from moving or even breathing properly. Something was wrong, very wrong. My mouth was dry, but I tried to call out for my parents. "Mom." My voice came out as a whisper, choked. No one heard. The scratching continued, now clearer, as if those claws were slowly etching lines into the wood, perhaps even trying to break through it. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, that something natural was happening. My mind fought against the growing panic, searching for any explanation that might ease that visceral fear. Maybe it was a branch from a tree, a draft, anything but what I was imagining. But the sound was persistent, and it seemed to move back and forth beneath the bed, as if whatever was there knew exactly where I was lying. I didn't have the courage to look down. The idea of lowering my head to see what was there terrified me. My body was frozen, and my mind spun with possibilities that only made the fear grow more. I forced myself to breathe, to try to reason. It was just the dark and my imagination, right? Childhood fear has a way of turning the unknown into monsters. And then I saw something that made me question everything. The sound stopped, abruptly, and absolute silence filled the room, as if the entire world had paused for a moment. I finally prepared to call my parents out loud, to end that torture, when something emerged from beneath the bed. My heart raced, and the scream I was about to let out got stuck in my throat. My dad. He emerged slowly, crawling across the floor, as if he were sneaking for some reason. First I saw his head, then his body, until he stood up in the darkened room. I recognized him immediately by his silhouette. I was completely still, unable to comprehend what was happening. My dad had never done anything like this before. The expression on his face was hidden by shadows, but he was there, standing in the middle of the room, watching me. I couldn't speak, but he did it for me. "You forgot to say your prayers," he said calmly, in a voice that sounded exactly like he always said. But something was wrong, very wrong. The way he had crawled out from under the bed, the calmness in his voice, as if that was the most normal thing in the world. Before I could react or ask anything, he left the room, walking calmly and not looking back. I stayed there, watching the door close slowly. Terror took hold of me again. I curled up under the blankets, hoping he would come back, that something would explain that situation. But he never returned. That night, somehow, I finally fell asleep, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow. Something was deeply wrong that night. but I was too young to understand what. The weeks following that night passed in a strange manner. Despite my age, I knew something wasn't right. The incident wouldn't leave my mind. It was like a fragment of a nightmare that didn't dissipate with the dawn. I continued living my life as a child, but the memory of that night persisted. Every time I lay down in bed, I felt a deep and silent anxiety. The room, which had once been a place of peace and comfort, now seemed to hold something else, something hidden in the shadows, something I couldn't understand, but that was there, waiting, watching me. I tried to talk about it with my parents several times. At first, my mom just laughed, thinking I had dreamed it. She told me that when children are tired or scared, their imagination can play tricks on them. My dad also didn't take it seriously. He always said the same thing, that I must have been confusing things, that it was just the product of my childish imagination. And he repeated it with such conviction that I almost began to believe it. Almost. But every time I tried to forget, something pulled me back. The image of my dad crawling beneath the bed, the suffocating feeling that something was wrong, and that phrase, "You forgot to say your prayers." It made no sense to me. Why would he do something like that? And why did he act as if nothing had happened? It was as if the incident had been erased from his memory, but left etched in mine. And as time passed, an uncomfortable doubt began to arise. Was that really my father? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just trying to play a trick on me, something strange he did without thinking, and for some reason, didn't want to admit. But there was something about that night that deeply unsettled me, something I couldn't explain. One day, months after the incident, I found the courage to speak to him directly, without beating around the bush. We were on the porch, my father sitting in his rocking chair, and me beside him, tossing pebbles into the garden. The sound of the chair creaking on the wooden floor accompanied the rhythm of the wind, and the sun was beginning to set. "Dad," I started, my voice trembling. "Do you remember that night when you crawled out from under my bed?" He looked at me, furrowing his brow. "What are you talking about, son?" "That night, I heard scratching under the bed, and then you crawled out and said I had forgotten to pray." My father fell silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on mine. Then he laughed. But it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a nervous chuckle, almost forced. "I never did that, son. You must have dreamed it," I insisted. "It wasn't a dream. I saw you. I heard you. What were you doing down there?" He stopped rocking the chair. The smile faded and the expression on his face closed off, as if he were trying to recall something distant. But then, suddenly, he shook his head, dismissing the topic as if it were irrelevant. "Don't make up stories. I wasn't there." He stood up and went inside the house without saying another word. I sat there for a while, staring at the empty chair, trying to understand what that meant. Why was he so reluctant to admit something so simple? Or did he really not remember? The idea scared me even more. What if my father really hadn't done that? What if I was confusing something? Or worse, if someone I thought was my father had actually been there that night? As time went on, the questions multiplied while the answers remained elusive. I began to distance myself from him. Something about that conversation made me feel like I couldn't fully trust my own father. The bedroom at night was never the same. The silence that once brought peace now throbbed with secrets. The scratching of wood beneath the bed continued to echo in my dreams, but always before I woke, I saw that familiar silhouette crawling out from under the bed, as if it were a part of me that refused to be left behind. During the day, I could forget a little, losing myself in play and chores on the farm. But at night, the fear returned. I started having trouble sleeping, always keeping one eye open, waiting for something to move in the dark. Every little noise in the silence seemed amplified, and my mind began to create connections where there shouldn't have been any. Sometimes, I caught myself looking at my bedroom door, hoping my father would appear again, but he never did. Years passed, and as expected, I grew up. However, the incident never completely left me. Each time I mentioned it to my father, he vehemently denied it. What had once seemed like a simple childhood prank transformed into something larger, something I needed to resolve. My adolescence was marked by this search for meaning. I couldn't understand how something that felt so real could simply be a product of my imagination. I began looking for answers in all the wrong places. I researched sleep disorders, sleepwalking, dissociation. I tried to find a rational explanation that would ease my mind, something to convince me it had really been a dream, a flaw in perception. But the more I searched, the more the questions piled up. Why was that memory so vivid? And why did my father never admit anything, even as the years went by? There were moments when I convinced myself I was being irrational, that perhaps I was fixating too much on an insignificant incident. I had my life to live. I went to college, moved to a big city, distanced myself from that farm, that room, and everything it represented. But even with all the distractions of adult life, that memory remained, like a thorn lodged in my mind, impossible to remove. Then, many years later, as an adult, something strange happened. I had returned to visit my parents at the farm. They were older now, my father's hair growing increasingly gray, his hands more tremulous. The house was the same comfortable silence, the same smell of wood and damp earth. It was as if time had stopped there. I was helping my mother organize some things in the attic when I found a box of old photos. Among the family pictures of parties and events I barely remembered, there was one photo that caught my attention. It was a picture of my father, still young, smiling next to a man I didn't recognize. They were in front of the farmhouse with the sun shining behind them. But what made me freeze was the detail in the man's hands. His nails were exceptionally long, sharp like claws. I asked my mother about the man. She looked at the photo with curiosity and after a moment said, "Oh, that's your great-uncle Henry. He lived with us for a while, many years before you were born. He had some strange habits, but he was a good man." I didn't know what to say. That photo made my stomach churn. Something about that man seemed familiar, but at the same time I had never heard of him before. And those nails, long, sharp, exactly like the ones I remembered hearing scratching the floor beneath my bed. Suddenly, the memories of that night flooded back with overwhelming force. The questions began to align in a way I had never considered before. Could it be possible that I didn't want to think any further? It was just a photo, a man I had never known. But at the same time, something inside me screamed that it wasn't a coincidence. Whatever had happened that night ran deeper than I could ever imagine. After finding that photo in the attic, something within me awakened. The image of the man standing next to my father, with his long, sharp nails, wouldn't leave my mind. The sense of familiarity troubled me deeply, as if I had somehow known that figure before, even though I had never even heard the name Henry until that day. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together. But at the same time, the more I tried to understand, the more the answers seemed to slip through my fingers. That night, after discovering the photo, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of the wind outside, the occasional creaking of the old house. But instead of bringing me comfort, those familiar sounds only fueled the restlessness inside me. Every little noise seemed to echo louder, as if the house itself was trying to tell me something. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was in turmoil, revisiting every detail of that distant night from my childhood. And now, with this new piece of the puzzle, my great-uncle Henry, it all seemed even more complex. The next morning, I couldn't help but ask more about Henry. We were in the kitchen, my mother frying eggs in the pan, the smell of coffee filling the air. My father was on the porch, reading the newspaper, as he did every morning. "Mom, could you tell me more about Henry? What was he like?" My mother paused for a moment, as if she were reorganizing her memories. "Well, he was a reserved man. Strange, but he was never bad. He lived with us for a while before you were born. He had some odd habits, like, for example, he never cut his nails. Apparently, he had a superstition about it. My father was the same way. He believed that cutting nails brought bad luck." I listened attentively. Each word from her seemed to confirm something I already knew, but at the same time, it deepened the mystery. "Was he close to Dad?" I asked, trying to disguise the tension in my voice. She shrugged. "Not particularly. Your father was never very close to anyone, not even family, but Henry liked to play with him when he was little. They spent a good amount of time together. However, when he left, we never heard from him again." "He left suddenly?" I pressed, trying to hide my curiosity. She fell silent for a few seconds, as if hesitant. "Yes, I don't remember the details, but it was kind of abrupt. One night, he just wasn't there anymore. I never understood why. My father said he had his own demons to deal with." I remained quiet, absorbing this new information. I tried not to appear disturbed, but my mind was spinning in 1,000 directions. Could Henry's sudden disappearance have something to do with that night? Could he somehow be involved in what happened to me? Perhaps he never really left. The thought was absurd, yet I couldn't shake it. That afternoon, I went to the barn, where my father kept several boxes of old things. I knew there were items stored there that dated back to the time when Henry lived with them. I started rummaging through the dusty boxes, searching for any clues, anything that could give me more information about him. After hours of searching, I found a box labeled Henry in an old, shaky handwriting. Inside the box were a series of personal items, some old clothes, letters addressed to him, but what truly caught my attention was a small notebook. It was a diary, but the pages were faded, almost illegible with age. I began to flip through it, trying to decipher what was written. The handwriting was difficult to read, but what I could make out intrigued me. He wrote about dreams, recurring nightmares, visions of shadows creeping under doors, things hidden beneath beds. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. The descriptions reminded me so much of what I experienced as a child. One of the last entries froze me in place. I feel like I'm being followed again. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me or something more sinister. The sound of nails scraping against the wood is back. He found me. My heart raced. I didn't know what to think. Who was he? What was really happening with Henry? Whatever it was, it had clearly affected him deeply, enough for him to flee or disappear without a trace. But what unsettled me most was the mention of the sound of nails. It was exactly what I had heard the night when my father, or whoever it was, came out from under my bed. I took the diary inside, wanting to confront my father with what I had discovered. But as I entered the living room, I paused. He was sitting on the couch, looking out the window with an expression I had never seen before. He seemed disturbed. For a brief moment, I thought about turning back, about putting the diary away and forgetting everything. But something inside me wouldn't let me. "Dad," I said, approaching slowly, "I need to show you something." He didn't turn immediately, but after a few seconds, he looked at me, his eyes seeming distant. I handed him the diary, watching his expression as he flipped through the pages. When he reached the entry I mentioned, he stopped. His fingers trembled slightly as they touched the paper, and for a moment I thought he might say something, but instead, he closed the diary with a sharp movement and set it aside. "This is nonsense," he said coldly without looking me in the eye. "Henry was always different. He had mental issues. You shouldn't take this seriously." But the way he spoke, the tone of his voice didn't convince me. He was hiding something. I knew it. No matter how hard he tried to disguise it, there was fear in his eyes, something he didn't want to admit. I decided not to press him at that moment, but the distrust within me continued to grow. In the following days, I began to pay more attention to the details. My father started to act strangely, as if he were always on alert, as if he were expecting something to happen. There was a tense silence in the house, something I couldn't define. It felt like we were all trapped in a web of secrets, and no one knew how to break free from it. Then one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, as usual, trying to ignore the anxieties that always lurked in the corners of my mind. The silence of the house was heavy, almost suffocating. That's when I heard it, the sound. The same sound I had heard so many years ago. Scratching. Slowly, under the bed. My body froze. I couldn't move, as if every part of me had suddenly been filled with that paralyzing fear from my childhood. The sound continued, rhythmic, insistent. My thoughts were in chaos. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening again. I tried to muster the courage to move, to get out of bed and see what was happening, but I couldn't. The fear was absolute. That's when I felt it. Something was moving under the bed. Not just a sound now, but a presence. Something that shouldn't be there. I knew I couldn't stay still. With all the strength I could gather, I jumped out of bed and ran for the door, not looking back. I headed straight for my parents' room, just like I had done when I was a child. But this time, something was different. When I opened the door to their room, I found my father sitting on the edge of the bed, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes were empty, cold. "You heard it again, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost casual. I didn't know how to respond. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at him, unsure of what to do. "It's better if you forget this, son," he said. "Forget all of it." But I couldn't. Something was very wrong. I knew that. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just what was under the bed that scared me. It was my father. Something about him had changed. Or maybe it had always been that way, and I simply hadn't noticed. That night, I decided I could no longer stay in that house. There was something wrong with everything. Something I couldn't explain. I grabbed Henry's diary and left without looking back. I didn't know what my father was hiding, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. There were too many secrets, and the feeling that something deeper was happening grew stronger every day. After leaving my parents' house, life in the city wasn't exactly the refuge I had hoped for. At first, I tried to immerse myself in routine, distracting myself with work and friends, trying to leave behind whatever was happening on that farm. But the truth is, I never managed to escape completely. The memory of those nights, the strange conversations with my father, the discovery of Henry's diary, all of it haunted my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't avoid. It took me weeks just to open the diary again. It sat hidden in a drawer, out of sight, but never far from my mind. Every time I tried to forget, something seemed to pull my attention back to that object. When I finally gathered the courage to open it again, The text inside seemed more enigmatic than ever. The pages were filled with scribbles and disordered notes, many of them nearly illegible. There were passages about Henry's constant fear, about him feeling a presence around him, especially at night. The paranoia he described in his words was almost suffocating, and in a way all too familiar to me. One phrase in particular stuck in my mind. He found me. I'm never alone. Even when I think I'm safe, I feel he's near. Henry was clearly referring to something or someone, but who or what was it? I began to wonder if what he was describing was purely mental, some kind of psychological disturbance. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think that maybe there was something real, something connected in some way to that house. Then something strange began to happen to me. I was in my apartment late one night when I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It was low, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. It wasn't the typical noise of neighbors or plumbing. It was more familiar. I got up from bed, my heart racing, and walked toward the bedroom door, trying to listen better. Scratches. There they were again. The sound I thought I had left behind with my childhood. But this time it was in my apartment, here in the city. I stood still for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Perhaps I was so immersed in Henry's story that I began to imagine things. But the sound persisted, insistent, coming from somewhere inside the apartment. I followed the sound to the living room, moving slowly, senses on high alert. Each step seemed to amplify my anxiety. When I arrived in the living room, I stopped in front of the sofa, where the sound seemed to be emanating. I crouched down slowly, my fingers sweaty as I lifted the skirt of the sofa and looked underneath. Nothing. The space was empty. I knelt there for a few seconds, trying to calm my breathing. Then I noticed something strange. On the wooden floor right beneath the sofa, there were scratch marks. They weren't deep, but they were there. Thin, almost imperceptible trails, as if someone or something had dragged its nails across the wood's surface. I stood up abruptly and returned to the bedroom, trying to push away the irrational thoughts that surged in my mind. I needed to convince myself that this was just a coincidence, or maybe just normal wear and tear on the floor. But deep down I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was following me, something I couldn't see, but that seemed determined to make its presence felt. The following nights were disturbing. I continued to hear the sounds, but they never fully revealed themselves. Scratches on the walls, soft footsteps in the hallway, all of this contributed to the growing sense of paranoia that settled within me. I started sleeping less and less, afraid to close my eyes and lose control of the situation. I didn't want to admit it, but whatever had started on that farm years ago was still with me, and it seemed to be getting closer every day. One night, after a week of hardly being able to sleep, I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. The apartment was completely silent, but something felt different. I sensed a presence, as if I wasn't alone there. I looked around in the dark, trying to find something out of the ordinary, but nothing moved. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Then I heard the sound of something falling in the kitchen. I got up slowly, my senses on high alert, and moved toward the kitchen. Upon entering, I noticed that one of the chairs at the table had fallen to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and when I stood, I felt a cold breeze pass by me, as if someone had just moved beside me. I turned immediately, but no one was there. Panic began to overtake me, and I ran back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. That night, I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of the city coming to life outside. With the daylight, things seemed less threatening, but I knew I couldn't continue living like this. Something was pursuing me, something I couldn't see, but that was growing bolder every day. That's when I made a decision. I needed to go back to the farm. I needed to confront my father, discover the truth about Henry, and understand what was happening to me. I couldn't run from it any longer. If I wanted to find peace, I had to return to the place where it all began. 2 days later, I was on the road, driving back to the house where I grew up. The journey was long and silent. As I drove, childhood memories surged back, increasingly vivid. I remembered how that house, which had once been my safe haven, now seemed to be the epicenter of all the strange things that had happened in my life. And now I was returning, unsure of what I would find. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky beginning to turn orange with the sunset. The house looked untouched by time, but there was a different aura surrounding it, something I couldn't quite explain. My father was sitting on the porch, as always, but this time he seemed older, more tired. He looked at me as I got out of the car, but he said nothing. I approached him, feeling the tension between us. "We need to talk, Dad," I said, my voice steady. He nodded slowly and got up, guiding me inside the house. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence between us almost unbearable. "You always knew what was happening, didn't you?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. He sighed, rubbing his tired face. "I knew, but I never knew how to deal with it. Henry, he was never the same after a certain age. Something haunted him, something no one could understand." "But it wasn't just about Henry, was it?" I pressed. "This is happening to me too. Since that night, when you came out from under my bed, or whoever it was." He looked into my eyes, and for the first time I saw fear in them. "I never came out from under your bed," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I swear to you, son, that wasn't me." My blood ran cold. His words confirmed something I had always suspected but never wanted to believe. If that hadn't been my father that night, then who or what was it? Before I could respond, we heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was soft but unmistakable. Scratches, long and slow. I looked at my father, and he slowly rose, his face pale. "It's happening again," he murmured. We climbed the stairs together, each step heavier than the last. When we reached the top, the sound had stopped, but upon opening the door to my old room, we saw the marks on the floor. Deep scratches like claws, tracing a path to beneath the bed. I stood there, staring at those marks, while my father approached slowly, almost fearful of what he might find. He knelt down and looked under the bed, as if waiting to see something familiar. But after a moment, he stood up and looked at me with a mix of sadness and resignation. "It will never stop," he said. "This, whatever it is, has always been here. Even before Henry, I tried to protect you, but I guess I couldn't." I stood there, unsure of what to do. The answers I had sought for so long were right there, but at the same time they made no sense. Whatever was in that house, on that farm, couldn't be explained logically. And somehow I knew I would never find an explanation that would put me at ease. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch, looking at the horizon, waiting for dawn. The sound of the scratches still echoed in my mind, and I knew with an unsettling certainty that it would never completely go away. Whatever had been following me, whatever was in that house, was still there. It would always be there. I could keep running, trying to escape, but deep down I knew that it was a part of me now. And maybe, just maybe, it always had been.